ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is a nonpartisan political action group that united in anger and committed to nonviolent direct action to end the AIDS crisis. ACT UP gave a voice to people living with HIV/AIDS since the late 1980s. Through their actions, ACT UP changed the course of the epidemic, how we view healthcare in the United States, and established a successful model for activism in bringing about government change. I chose to look deeper in the ACT UP New York archive as it was a clear example of giving voice to the voiceless, which are people living with HIV/AIDS, challenging dominant narratives from traditional institutions like the Catholic Church, complicating the public memory of institutional response as seen in the absence of ACT UP's role in the CDC's timeline, and of the parallels with the current COVID pandemic such as government negligence and societal prejudices. The ACT UP New York archive has documentation of activists fiercely holding these dominant power institutions accountable and fighting for change through strategic protests and acts of civil disobedience in key locations that accelerated response. On March 10th, Larry Kramer, a playwright and LGBTQ rights activist, called for the formation of an AIDS activist group. 2 days later, on March 12, 1987, around 300 people arrived at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in Manhattan for the establishment of ACT UP. This illustrates the energy and urgency for action at the time. One of ACT UP's legacies were the graphic arts and symbols used to create messages. For example, the ubiquitous "Silence Equals Death" poster was created after physical attacks on gays and lesbians. The poster featured a pink triangle on a black background, a reference to the pink triangle forced on homosexuals by Nazi Germany, but inverted to signify hope. The poster's slick representation on a glossy black background drew on advertising techniques and forced the reader to lean in close to read the political text in small font at the bottom, including "Why is Reagan silent about AIDS? What is really going on at the CDC, FDA, and Vatican? Turn anger, fear, grief into action." This well-crafted logo gives the viewer a more credible perception of the graphic art as a whole. Thus, when the viewer reads the words at the bottom, there is more authority to the call to action, leaving more of an impact on the viewer. When the first HIV drug, AZT, came to the market in 1987, it cost $10,000 a year. $10,000 a year at the time was the highest price ever set for any drug in history. In ACT UP's first action on March 24th, 1987, protesters marched on Wall Street to protest the profiteering of pharmaceutical companies on AIDS drugs. Zooming into the images, you can see that the protesters are on Wall Street because the Federal Hall is behind them, which neighbors the New York Stock Exchange. Traders were able to see and hear ACT UP members, driving in the real-life impact of their trading on people in need. Also in the picture, protesters were holding images of A.J. Shepard, chairman of Burroughs Wellcome, putting a face to the name of the person who played a large role in raising the prices of treatment. The other sign said, "Sell Burroughs Wellcome," which caused uncertainty for the company's stock. 3 days later, Burroughs Wellcome lowered the price of AZT from $10,000 a year to $3,200 a year. On October 11th, 1988, hundreds of AIDS activists organized by ACT UP surrounded the FDA Park Lawn headquarters building in Washington, D.C. to protest the slow drug approval process that prevented access to treatments and cost patients' lives. Let's take a closer look at the signs and posters put up by protesters. The first two signs held up are gravestones that read "Dead from lack of drugs" and "Dead from lack of dextran sulfate." By linking the death to lack of drugs, it shows the FDA has the power to save thousands of lives if they speed up their drug approval process. Dextran sulfate was one of the compounds that had promising results when treating HIV patients, but had not yet been approved by the FDA for public usage. In the other two images, the activists focus on President Reagan. Throughout the growing AIDS epidemic in the 80s, the Reagan administration did little and even obstructed action. 3 years into the epidemic, more than 5,000 deaths due to AIDS-related illnesses had taken place. Larry Speakes, Reagan's White House press secretary, was asked about the HIV/AIDS epidemic and how the president was going to take steps to address the situation. He stated that the president had not expressed any concern. He even went on to joke about AIDS being a gay plague and laughingly asked the reporter if he had HIV. This exchange illustrated that Reagan and his administration didn't take the epidemic seriously. At this point, the general population still thought of AIDS as a gay disease and that it could be transmitted through saliva. The strategic protests at the FDA sped up the drug approval process that allowed for more effective alternatives to AZT to be released to the public. It also exposed the ignorance and callous attitude of the Reagan administration in responding to the serious AIDS epidemic. The Stop the Church demonstration by ACT UP members accompanied by Women's Health Action and Mobilization demonstration was one of ACT UP's largest events. On December 10th, 1989, ACT UP members disrupted Mass being held by Cardinal John O'Connor at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City and attended by Mayor Ed Koch. The demonstration was to protest O'Connor's opposition to the teaching of safe sex in the public school system and his opposition to the distribution of condoms to curb the spread of AIDS. Observing the pamphlet on the left, you can clearly see the time and location of the protest, as well as their arguments. This pamphlet was given out to activists and pedestrians, significantly adding to the population of the demonstration. The image on the right shows political messaging mocking the Cardinal's false information who said condoms don't stop the spread of STDs. ACT UP activists say the St. Patrick's protest changed the way many Americans viewed the Catholic Church. It was no longer untouchable, and its policies on everything from condoms and abortion to gay marriage and women priests were no longer sacrosanct. Tamar Carroll, author of Mobilizing New York, AIDS, Anti-Poverty, and Feminist Activism, writes of this demonstration that ACT UP's dramatic confrontation with O'Connor epitomizes the challenges to dominant gender and sexual order and the backlash against them that came to be known as the culture wars. The culture wars were directly tied to the religious right and pro-family movement's attempts to regulate national morality. ACT UP's challenge to the Catholic Church disrupted their agenda and dominant social standing. ACT UP and women's health advocates found a common cause. To have AIDS, a person had to be HIV positive and diagnosed with a particular opportunistic disease such as Kaposi sarcoma and PCP, most of which were observed in gay men at the start of the epidemic. The CDC did not recognize bacterial pneumonia, cervical cancer, or pelvic inflammatory disease as symptoms of AIDS in women, and so HIV positive women were often diagnosed with AIDS-related complex. As a result, these women were denied the social security benefits that men with AIDS had fought hard to secure in the late 1980s. ACT UP New York and ACT UP Atlanta organized a 2-day protest in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 8, 1990. The image on the left shows a poster that reads, "Women don't get AIDS, they just die from it," which shows the deadly irony of CDC's current definition. The image on the right expresses other common slogans used during this action. Finally, in 1992, the CDC changed the AIDS definition to anyone with depleted reserve of helper T cells, CD4 count less than 200. This now included women and enabled them to collect benefits and participate in treatment trials. As you can see in the image, the CDC's HIV/AIDS timeline does not acknowledge the efforts of ACT UP or other AIDS activists who push hard to expand these definitions, a common pattern seen throughout the timeline. This shows how dominant government agencies can leave out historical events and movements, effectively erasing them from public memory. Many parallels can be seen between the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of acknowledging the crisis and the response. Both Presidents Reagan and Trump neglected addressing the issue promptly, causing thousands of more lives to be lost. In both situations, the reasons for hesitance were political. In the instance of HIV/AIDS, prejudice against the LGBTQ community and opposition from the Catholic Church were among the causes for the slow response. This stigma, in turn, often caused people to not get tested or seek treatment because they feared discrimination at their workplace or community. In the instance of COVID, politicians and health leaders initially did not want to cause panic and did not recognize the seriousness of the problem, which turned out to be a costly error in judgment. Secondly, politicians worried about the impact of limiting travel and physical distancing to protect COVID's negative impact on the economy, while some refused making masks mandatory as it interfered with individual rights. This made some states ease restrictions prematurely or not mandate masks in public places, causing subsequent waves of COVID. Both the HIV epidemic and COVID pandemic inflamed the disparities among the minorities. In the case of HIV/AIDS epidemic, media outlets did not want to report on anything that had to do with the gay community. People with these prejudiced views called it the gay virus and would go assaulting gay people. For the COVID pandemic, anti-Asian sentiment was festering due to COVID originating in Wuhan, China, with the verbal and physical attacks on Chinese Americans. Many other Asians were lumped together with Chinese Americans by a bigotry that does not know the difference. Looking through the ACT UP archive has complicated my understanding of the AIDS epidemic. For example, in school we briefly discussed HIV in health class and did not even discuss it in social studies. When learning about Reagan, I learned about the good things he accomplished, but never learned that he actively neglected a whole population. I'm also frightened by how these institutions play a role in what is considered public memory and how they can cover up their own tracks and can escape accountability. Archives like ACT UP play a crucial role in preserving history and sharing stories during a time of homophobia and neglect, remembering those who sacrificed their lives in order to better the lives of others, even when institutions actively tried to stop them.
My name is Greg Ross. I live in San Jose, California. I just lost a friend of mine in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, he was Mormon, so he was not cremated, so I could not scatter his ashes here. And the main reason I'm here is to scatter my own ashes. I'm going to die of AIDS in probably 2 years, and that is why I'm here. And the one thing I want to say is it's God bless people like ACT UP that have allowed me to live longer than I would have otherwise. You guys have the courage, the strength, the commitment, and the love, and the compassion to help make my life longer. Until I die, I will join your force and help and hope to do others the same.